6:00 in the morning. The air inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Ranger headquarters held the night's chill, mixed with the faint scent of pine and damp earth drifting in through a slightly open window. The senior ranger, a sturdily built man of 45 with closely cropped graying hair and a face weathered by years of service outdoors, was conducting the morning briefing. His steady, calm voice filled the small room where his 3 subordinates sat around a common table. Beside him, listening intently, was Claire, a young woman of about 28, a tracker and EMTB, her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Opposite her sat a large man of about 35, the team's technician, responsible for heavy equipment and, if necessary, weapons. His massive hands rested calmly on the tabletop. The fourth was Lou, a combat medic with 18 Delta qualifications who also handled communications, a man around 30, with a focused expression. They discussed the day's planned tasks. Patrolling the sector designated Charlie 5 on the operational map, checking the condition of the suspension bridge over the Little River, recently repaired after spring floods, and addressing the increasing tourist complaints about bears sighted near Elkmont Campground. Nothing unusual, a routine familiar to everyone present. After the briefing, the methodical check of personal and team equipment began, as mandated by Standard Operating Procedure 7.2, Daily Equipment Readiness. The senior ranger personally inspected his Ford F250 pickup, checking the winch mounted on the front bumper, ensuring an adequate supply of drinking water in the jerrycans, and verifying the completeness of the emergency kit, which included everything from signal flares to fire-starting supplies. Claire meticulously checked the contents of her comprehensive tactical medical kit, ensured her Garmin Fortrex GPS navigator was working, and replaced its batteries with fresh ones. The technician inspected the 2 Polaris Sportsman ATVs parked in the headquarters garage, checked fuel and oil levels, and the condition of the steel chainsaw, often needed to clear fallen trees from trails. Lou, meanwhile, tested the Motorola APX 6000 radios, checking communication on various frequencies, confirmed the Iridium satellite phone was operational, an indispensable item in areas with no cell coverage, and also verified that the team's Rescue Link personal locator beacon was set to standby mode, ready for activation if needed. The Rangers' personal firearms, as law enforcement officers, were service pistols, Glock 22S chambered in .40S and W and Sig Sauer P229 DACAS, which were checked, each Ranger carrying 3 fully loaded magazines. In the gun safe, located in a specially equipped room at headquarters, were Remington 870 Police Magnum shotguns and Colt M4 LE 6920 carbines, intended for emergency situations requiring increased firepower. Finishing their checks, the Rangers gathered in the common room, briefly discussing minor incidents from the previous day over morning coffee. Careless tourists attempting to feed wild animals, strictly prohibited by park rules, and trash left by someone at a popular overlook. Claire mentioned that the day before, while patrolling near a creek, she had seen strange tracks in the damp soil. The prints were too large for a coyote, but didn't resemble bear tracks either, having an unusual shape. The senior ranger listening to her waved it off. "Those are tracks from a large stray dog," he declared. "They often get lost." A light morning mist, characteristic of the Smoky Mountains at this time of year, gently enveloped the foothills, hiding the peaks in a milky haze. The day promised to be ordinary. At 10:15 a.m., the measured flow of duty was interrupted. Lou, on radio watch, received a call from the Sevier County Sheriff's Office dispatcher. The message was alarming. A family of 4, a 42-year-old man, his 40-year-old wife, their 16-year-old son, and 14-year-old daughter, had failed to make contact with relatives at the scheduled time. Their rented Ford Explorer SUV had been found in the parking lot at the head of the Elkmont Trail. This route, popular with hikers, was known for its length, about 15 miles one way to an old Appalachian Club cabin, and in places quite challenging terrain. The family was supposed to have returned the previous evening, but they hadn't. The senior ranger immediately initiated the search and rescue protocol. Lou contacted the sheriff's office to obtain photographs of the missing tourists, detailed descriptions of their clothing, their presumed route, and information about their hiking experience. Claire was already checking the trail entry log and phoning a volunteer who had been on duty at the parking lot the day before. The technician began preparing search equipment, additional radio sets, ropes of various lengths and thicknesses, collapsible stretchers, powerful searchlights, and batteries for them. The first search team, codenamed Alpha, was formed. It included the senior ranger, Claire, and the technician. Lou remained at base, his task to coordinate the team's actions with headquarters and the sheriff's office, as well as maintain constant communication. The senior ranger ordered that if there were no results within 6 hours of starting the search, a second team would be prepared, and, weather permitting, low cloud cover was currently observed. Air support would be requested from the National Guard. Before departure, a short but comprehensive briefing was held. Using a large-scale map of the area, the senior ranger designated sectors for the presumed search, points where his experience suggested looking for lost people, and specifically noted dangerous sections of the route, steep cliffs hidden by dense vegetation and marshy lowlands off the main trail. He outlined the standard hazards of the route. Tourists often got lost by taking the wrong trail. Injuries always slowed progress. Encounters with black bears, though rare, were always considered. Wolves had not been officially reported in this area for many decades, although persistent rumors of their appearance circulated among locals. The senior ranger ordered the team to move along the trail in single file, carefully examining the sides, and when deviating from the route or searching in open terrain, to use a sweep formation for maximum coverage. Radio contact with base was to be maintained every 30 minutes. The group took water supplies and food rations for 48 hours. Additional warm clothing in case of spending the night in the mountains, powerful flashlights, GPS navigators, paper maps, and compasses. Weapons were loaded, but safeties were only to be disengaged in the event of a direct and clear threat. There were no questions for the senior ranger. Everyone understood the seriousness of the situation and their tasks. At 11:30 a.m., the senior ranger's pickup stopped at the small parking lot at the head of the Elkmont Trail. Alpha team had arrived. The technician, getting out of the truck, first headed to the blue Ford Explorer SUV belonging to the missing family. He carefully inspected the vehicle from the outside, then peered inside through the windows. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. The doors were locked. Inside, on the seats, were items typical for tourists: several park guidebooks, empty water bottles, a crumpled map of the area. Nothing indicated the reason for the people's disappearance. Claire, meanwhile, had already begun her work, moving from the missing family's SUV towards the trailhead. Her gaze methodically scanned the ground, searching for the slightest signs that would help determine the direction of travel and the number of people. Soon she found what she was looking for: faint but discernible tracks of 4 pairs of shoes leading up the rocky trail. Judging by the size and tread patterns, they belonged to 2 adults and 2 teenagers. The rangers moved along the route. The senior ranger led, setting the pace and carefully examining the trail and the surrounding forest. His years of experience told him what to look for: broken branches, trampled grass, any signs deviating from the natural state of the forest. Slightly behind and to his side followed Claire, her eyes fixed on the ground, literally reading the story left on the trail's surface. The technician brought up the rear, his task to cover their backs and watch the slopes rising on either side of the narrow trail. Every half hour, the senior ranger contacted base, Smoky Control, this is Alpha 1. Past checkpoint Bravo 2, approximately 3 miles from the trailhead. Tracks of the missing party are clear. They were moving together without stops. Weather conditions: fog gradually intensifying, visibility reduced to 100 yards and continues to drop. Continuing movement. Over. Lou's voice from base confirmed receipt of the information. Around 2 p.m., having covered about 5 miles on the winding, steadily ascending trail, the group reached a fork. Here, the main route veered right towards the pass, while a less noticeable, overgrown path branched off to the left, leading, according to the map, to an old, abandoned logging area. It was here, in the dense thicket of bushes at the edge of the path, that Claire noticed a bright splash of color. Approaching, she saw a child's bright pink backpack. It was, without a doubt, the missing girl's backpack. Next to the backpack, its few contents were scattered on the ground: a plastic water bottle, almost full, an uneaten sandwich in cellophane wrap, a small plush toy, a squirrel with a torn-off ear. There were no signs of struggle, blood, or any other indications of violence at the discovery site. The senior ranger, examining the backpack and scattered items, frowned. This was strange. People, especially in unfamiliar territory, didn't abandon their gear, especially with food and water supplies. Only extraordinary events causing panic or requiring immediate flight would make them do so. The senior ranger took a camera from his backpack and took several pictures of the discovery site from different angles, documenting the position of the backpack and scattered items. Claire, meanwhile, meticulously examined the ground around it. She found tracks of all 4 members of the missing family. But here at the fork, the tracks were jumbled, chaotic. The people had clearly darted back and forth before making some decision. And most importantly, from this point, the tracks no longer followed the main trail, but turned onto that barely noticeable path, leading into the dense forest thicket. The senior ranger considered this. One of the family members, a child, had wandered off from the main group. The others had rushed to find them, deviating from the route. Another possibility. An unknown threat had terrified them, forcing them to turn off the known trail into the unknown. After conferring, the rangers decided to follow these new tracks leading deeper into the forest. The path was narrow, littered with last year's leaves and fallen branches, and progress along it was significantly slower than on the main route. By 4:30 p.m., having ventured a couple more miles into the forest, the group reached a small stream flowing along the bottom of a shallow ravine. Here, on the damp, silty soil right by the water, Claire discovered other tracks that made even the experienced rangers freeze. These were huge, deeply impressed 5-toed prints with clearly defined marks of long, sharp claws. They definitely didn't belong to a bear. The prints were too narrow, elongated, and lacked the characteristic large heel pad impression of a bear's paw. They didn't resemble wolf tracks either. Firstly, wolves were considered an extinct species in these parts, and secondly, the size of the prints was simply incredible. The foot length of each track was at least 16 inches. The senior ranger, careful not to damage one of the clearest prints, took a special kit for making plaster casts from his backpack and set to work. The technician, watching this process, shook his head. "What the hell is this, Chief?" "Grizzlies never wandered this far south, that's for sure. And for a black bear, this is too much." The rangers exchanged worried glances. The atmosphere had subtly changed. Tension hung in the air. The technician voiced his guess. These were tracks of very large dogs, wolfhounds, used by poachers. But Claire disagreed, pointing out that the prints were too large even for the biggest dog breeds, and the shape of the toes and claws was somehow different, more predatory, more powerful. The senior ranger, having finished making the cast, ordered them to heighten their vigilance, keep their weapons ready, but not to draw them from their holsters without extreme necessity. This would prevent an accidental shot or panic upon encountering the unknown. Closer to 6 p.m., the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. The light, drizzling rain that had started about an hour ago turned into a heavier downpour. The fog, already dense, thickened so much that visibility dropped to a few dozen yards, transforming the surrounding forest into a blurred gray-green mess. At the same time, communication problems began. Lou's voice from base became fainter, interrupted by static, until finally it disappeared altogether. Only the dry crackle of static discharges could be heard in the radio speakers. The senior ranger tried several times to call base. "Smoky control, this is Alpha 1, how do you copy? Repeat, audibility is 0. We are moving on azimuth 315, seeking shelter to set up for the night. Over." There was no answer. They were alone, cut off from the outside world in the heart of a wild, unfamiliar forest, pursuing an unseen threat along tracks that were becoming increasingly ominous. By 7:30 p.m., as twilight rapidly deepened, turning the forest into a frightening realm of shadows, Alpha Team, following the now barely visible tracks of the missing family, and orienting themselves by GPS, navigator, and compass readings, emerged into a small clearing. In the clearing, amidst tall grass and thickets of wild bushes, several structures were visible. An old, dilapidated hunting camp. These were 2 leaning log cabins, their roofs caved in places, and their walls thickly overgrown with moss and lichen. A third structure had almost completely collapsed. The place had been abandoned decades ago and made an extremely sinister impression in the dim light of the fading day. accompanied by the ceaseless rain and the sound of wind in the treetops. The first signs of the impending tragedy were discovered almost immediately. Against the wall of one of the cabins, the one closest to the trail they had come by, a torn, dark blue men's jacket lay on the wet grass. Claire, checking against the photos of the missing persons they had received from the sheriff's office, confirmed the jacket belonged to the 16-year-old boy from the vanished family. Near the jacket, on the trampled grass and ground, were shallow furrows. Something heavy had been dragged from this spot towards the cabin. And on the jacket itself and on the grass around it were dark brown stains, which Claire, looking closer, identified with an alarmed tone as blood. The senior ranger, nodding silently, slowly unholstered his Glock 22. The technician, following his example, unslung the Remington 870 shotgun he had prudently brought from headquarters just in case, and checked if a round was chambered. Peeking inside the nearest cabin through a partially broken door, the rangers saw a scene that made their blood run cold. Even for people accustomed to various incidents in the wild, what they saw was beyond comprehension. On the earthen floor, amidst a jumble of old furniture and rubbish, lay the mutilated bodies of a man and a woman, the adult members of the missing family. Their clothes were torn to shreds, their bodies bore multiple gaping wounds, and bones were unnaturally twisted and broken. Everywhere there were signs of huge teeth and claws that had left deep furrows in the flesh and even on the bones. The heavy, nauseating smell of fresh and congealed blood, mixed with the scent of entrails, hit their noses, forcing them to recoil. Claire, struggling to suppress a gag reflex, forced herself to approach. As an EMTB, she had to assess the nature of the injuries as much as possible. After a few moments of tense examination, she quietly said to the senior ranger, her voice trembling with barely suppressed horror, This doesn't look like any predator I know, Chief. The size of the wounds, their nature, this is something completely different. No bear or cougar does this. The senior ranger, despite the obvious shock that gripped everyone, forced himself to act according to the protocol developed for critical incidents. His voice, when he gave commands, was tense but remained steady and clear. Technician, secure the outer perimeter immediately. Check the other structures, but be extremely careful. Claire, don't touch anything at the scene, but try to visually record the main injuries on the bodies and around. Any details are important. I'll try to contact base again, though chances are slim. In his eyes, usually calm and confident, now read the steel of will battling encroaching horror and a deep, almost animalistic anxiety. Attempts to contact base by radio were again unsuccessful. Only the crackle of static filled the air. The satellite phone, which the senior ranger took out of a special waterproof case, also showed no signs of life. There was no satellite network signal on its screen. Examining the scene more closely, the senior ranger found another huge smeared paw print on the damp earthen floor of the cabin, similar to those they had seen by the stream, only this one was even larger. And on one of the log walls near the doorway, symbols were crudely scratched, 3 parallel diagonal lines, intersected by one long horizontal line. The symbols were fresh, a clear mark from 3 enormous claws. Suddenly, all 3 rangers simultaneously felt it, a sharp, almost physically palpable feeling that they were being watched. From the depths of the darkening forest surrounding the clearing came the quiet snap of a dry branch then another, and a barely perceptible rustle that couldn't be attributed to wind or rain. It was someone's deliberate, cautious movement. The technician, returning after a quick check of the other cabins, reported that the other structures were empty, but he had found a trail of what he identified as children's footprints leading away from this camp, deeper into the forest, towards dense thickets. The senior ranger, assessing the situation, made a difficult decision. We have to try to find the children immediately. Move fast, but be extremely careful, and keep your weapons ready. A few hundred yards from the abandoned camp, at the edge of a deep, bush-covered ravine, they made their last find before complete darkness finally engulfed the forest. A torn t-shirt, the same as the one worn by the missing boy in the photograph, hung on the branch of a low-growing tree. And a little further away, in the mud at the very edge of the ravine, lay a single child's sneaker, sized for the missing girl. Near these items on the ground were even more of those same huge, frightening tracks, and on the leaves of the bushes were fresh, not yet rain-washed drops of blood. Hopes of finding the children alive dwindled with every minute, with every step that led them further into the unknown. Night fell on the Smoky Mountains, bringing with it not only darkness and cold, but also a premonition of an inevitable nightmare. 9 p.m. The rain, which had not stopped for several hours, intensified, turning into a cold, penetrating downpour. Complete, impenetrable darkness set in, which not even the powerful beams of the rangers' flashlights could dispel. The senior ranger, assessing the situation, realized that further searching in such conditions, in unfamiliar, rugged terrain, and with an unknown threat lurking somewhere nearby, was tantamount to suicide. He decided to set up a temporary camp and wait out the night. After a short search, he chose a relatively sheltered spot, a shallow rock niche, covered on 3 sides by massive stone ledges and dense thickets of rhododendron. "We're stopping here for the night." His voice was barely audible above the noise of the rain. "We'll build a small, maximally concealed fire. Technician, you're on first watch with me. Claire, get some rest, then you'll relieve the technician." They immediately began to organize their defense, acting in concert like a well-oiled machine, a result of years of small unit tactics training. First, they cleared a small space in front of the niche entrance, removing fallen leaves, dry branches, and small bushes, so that any approaching object would inevitably make noise. The senior ranger checked his pistol, ensured a round was chambered, and placed the weapon beside him on a specially laid waterproof ground sheet. The technician took up a position at the other edge of the niche entrance, his Remington 870 shotgun aimed into the darkness, illuminated only by the weak, flickering light of the small fire they had managed to build under the cover of the overhanging rock. His remaining shells were counted and laid out for quick access. About 10 rounds of buckshot were left for the Remington. Claire, wrapped in her storm cloak, sat by the fire trying to get warm. She was shivering, and it wasn't just the cold of her soaked clothes and the damp night. It was a different kind of chill, coming from within, from soul-chilling fear. About an hour of tense waiting passed. The rain continued to drum on the rocks and leaves, creating a monotonous, lulling background that, however, did not dull the ranger's heightened senses. And then, From the darkness enveloping the forest beyond their tiny island of light came the first sound not belonging to the elements. It was the quiet, mournful cry of a child. It was so realistic, so full of despair, that Claire involuntarily flinched and whispered, turning to the senior ranger, "Is that the girl?" "Emily." The senior ranger, with a sharp gesture, ordered her to be silent, his face in the firelight tense and grim. "Don't react," he hissed. "It's a trap." The crying continued for several more minutes, sometimes approaching, sometimes receding, playing on their nerves, testing their endurance. Then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. After a while, another sound came from the forest, a man's desperate cry for help. The voice was distorted by distance and the noise of the rain, but it had the inflections of the missing head of the family, whose remains they had seen hours ago. And then, when that cry also faded, a quiet, insidious whisper was heard, uttering their call signs and roles. "Senior, tracker, technician." The whisper came from everywhere and nowhere at once, chilling them to the bone. "Nobody move! Don't answer! I repeat, it's a trap!" snarled the senior ranger, his voice low and firm, but with undertones of barely restrained fury and anxiety. The rangers were tense to the limit. The technician gripped the fore end of his shotgun tighter, his knuckles white. He slowly swept the barrel from side to side, trying to discern any movement in the dancing shadows beyond the illuminated patch. Claire covered her ears, but the chilling whisper still penetrated directly into her brain. At 11:30 p.m., the wait ended. There was a sharp, deafening crack of breaking branches, and out of the darkness, right to the edge of the firelit space, leaped a huge, dark creature. At least 8 feet tall, it moved slightly hunched, supporting itself on incredibly long forelimbs ending in enormous claws, gleaming in the firelight. The creature's body was covered in thick, matted fur of a dark, almost black color. Its head was massive, with an elongated snout and yellow, almost phosphorescent eyes burning in the darkness, full of wild fury and intelligence. It moved on 2 legs, but its gait was more animalistic than human. The senior ranger and the technician reacted instantly, almost simultaneously. The senior ranger's Glock barked twice, spitting flames. The technician's Remington 870 boomed with a deafening shot, sending a spray of heavy buckshot towards the beast. The creature let out a deafening roar, full of pain and rage. Several bullets and buckshot pellets hit their mark. Dark, rapidly wetting patches appeared on its hide, but it didn't fall, didn't even stagger. Instead, with incredible speed, it lunged forward, straight at the technician. He managed to fire once more, almost point blank, but the beast, uttering a guttural snarl, swatted him aside with a powerful blow from its forelimb as if he were a small doll. The technician flew several feet, hitting his back against the rock, and his shotgun fell from his weakened hands. A crimson stain instantly spread on his shoulder and side, where the creature's claws had raked him. One of its claws, belonging to what they would later realize was the Alpha itself, also raked across the senior ranger's left forearm as he instinctively shoved Claire clear, leaving 3 shallow but agonizingly painful scratches. The contact, however brief, seemed to sear with an unnatural heat, a venom distinct and far more aggressive than the wounds inflicted on the technician. The creature, having sustained several serious wounds and clearly frightened by the fire or the resolute defense, let out another long, blood-curdling howl that echoed through the night forest, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, vanished into the surrounding darkness. Claire, overcoming her initial shock, immediately rushed to the wounded technician, pulling dressing materials from her medkit. The senior ranger, quickly reloading his pistol, approached the edge of the lit area, staring intently into the darkness. His hands, usually steady as steel, were now trembling slightly. He said hoarsely, more to himself than to the others, That wasn't an animal. That was a werewolf." The word hung in the damp night air, heavy and terrifying, like the reality they had just encountered. Claire immediately began to provide first aid to the wounded technician. Her movements were quick and precise, honed to automaticity by numerous training sessions in combat casualty care. She quickly assessed the wound. The unknown creature's claws had left 3 deep, ragged gashes on the technician's shoulder and side, from which blood was flowing profusely. Major arteries were not severed, but blood loss was significant. Using the contents of her individual first aid kit, she first applied a tight pressure dressing to stop the bleeding, then cleaned the wound edges with antiseptic, and applied a quick-clot hemostatic bandage designed for rapid control of severe bleeding. After that, she administered a painkiller from a syringe. The man was conscious but severely weakened by blood loss and shock, his face pale and covered in sweat. The senior ranger approached and placed a hand on his healthy shoulder. "Hang in there, big guy. We still need you. We'll get you out of here." The technician nodded weakly, clenching his teeth. Dawn brought only a gray, dreary, foggy morning. The rain had stopped, but low, heavy clouds still hung over the forest, blocking the sun's rays. Attempts to contact base by radio were again unsuccessful. The airwaves were dead. The satellite phone, which the senior ranger tried to use again, was completely disabled. Its screen was shattered and the casing damaged, the result of a fall and impact during the night attack and commotion. Now they were completely cut off from the outside world without communication, with one seriously wounded man in the heart of hostile territory. The senior ranger and Claire carefully examined the site of the night battle in the dim morning light. They found several tufts of coarse, dark gray, almost black fur snagged on bush branches where the creature had attacked and retreated. On the ground and leaves were drops of the attacker's blood. It was thick, dark, almost black, and had a strange, faint, metallic smell. The .40S and W bullets from the senior ranger's pistol and the 12-gauge buckshot from the technician's shotgun had left deep marks in the nearby tree trunks, some where they had missed the target, others where the creature, after being hit, had leaned against them. The bark was torn, and in some places, deep dents were visible in the wood. The rangers looked at each other in silence. Any skepticism that remained until that moment had completely vanished. They had come face to face with something that, until now, had existed for them only in nightmares, ancient legends, and pulp horror stories. The senior ranger, whose maternal grandfather was a full-blooded Cherokee and had grown up in these mountains, suddenly remembered his half-forgotten stories about wolf people, or skinwalkers as they were called in the tribal language. Creatures capable of changing their form, possessing superhuman strength and cunning, and inhabiting the most remote and inaccessible corners of Appalachia. Back in childhood, he had perceived these stories as scary tales, but now the task before them had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a search and rescue operation. This was a desperate fight for survival. During the night attack, when the creature, the Alpha, as they now suspected from the sheer ferocity and the unnatural speed of the ensuing infection, had lunged, its claws had raked the senior ranger's left forearm. At the time, in the chaos of the fight, he had paid little attention to it. But now, in the light of day, he felt something was wrong with the wound. The scratches from the Alpha, though initially seeming minor, now burned with an unholy intensity. The skin around them an angry red and unnaturally hot to the touch. A virulence that seemed far more aggressive and swift-acting than the infection now slowly consuming the technician. He quickly treated them with the remaining antiseptic from his kit and tightly bandaged them with a clean dressing, trying not to draw his companion's attention to it. But an unpleasant, uneasy premonition settled deep within him. The shift in priorities was evident. The senior ranger, gathering the remaining members of the group, outlined a new plan of action. We're getting out of here immediately. Our main task is to reach the nearest passable road or any sufficiently high point from which we can send a distress signal. Try to fix the satellite phone, and if not, build a large signal fire. Technician, how are you feeling? Can you walk with support? The wounded ranger, whom Claire helped to his feet, gritted his teeth and nodded. I'll try, Chief. Can't leave you two here to have all the fun alone. His attempt at a joke sounded weak, but there was determination in his eyes. Moving through the dense, damp forest, they constantly looked back, listening to every rustle, every snap of a branch. The feeling of being watched never left them for a moment. The forest, which just yesterday had been merely a complex but familiar workspace for them, had now turned into a hostile trap full of deadly dangers. They were prey. And the hunter pursuing them was not just smart and strong. It was something inhuman, ancient, and incredibly cunning. Every step was a struggle, not only because of the difficult terrain and the need to support their wounded comrade, but also because of the crushing weight of fear and uncertainty. The fog still clung tightly to the mountains, obscuring landmarks and intensifying the feeling of isolation and hopelessness. The hope of rescue became increasingly faint with every mile traveled. They had been walking for several hours, trying to conceal their tracks as much as possible, choosing rocky sections, crossing streams to throw off any potential pursuer. But the instinctive, almost animalistic feeling that they were being relentlessly followed never left either the senior ranger or Claire. Sometimes, a distant, mournful howl reached their ears, chilling the blood in their veins. It sounded like neither wolf nor dog. There was something alien, unearthly about it. Sometimes, on the periphery of their vision, they noticed a fleeting movement in the dense thicket of the forest, a dark silhouette that flashed and then disappeared. The werewolves, they no longer doubted there were several, that it was an entire pack, did not make open attacks during daylight hours. But they constantly reminded them of their unseen presence, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse with them, slowly but surely exhausting them physically and, even worse, psychologically. Meanwhile, the senior ranger's condition continued to worsen. The scratch on his left forearm, inflicted by the Alpha, was severely inflamed despite treatment and bandaging. The skin around the wound had turned a purplish blue and became even hotter. He began to suffer from bouts of nausea and dizziness. But the strangest and most alarming thing, his senses sharpened to a painful degree. He heard the slightest rustle in the forest that his companions didn't notice, distinguished smells from a great distance, saw minute details in the semi-darkness of the undergrowth. From time to time, short, bright visions, like flashes of lightning, appeared before his eyes. The forest as it looked through the eyes of a predator stalking prey. Smells, sounds, distorted colors. He carefully concealed these symptoms from Claire and the wounded technician, so as not to frighten them further and not to sow doubts about his ability to command the group. But the struggle with these escalating changes in his own body and mind was draining more and more of his strength. After several hours of grueling travel, when their strength was nearly exhausted, especially the wounded technician's, who was walking with the support of an improvised crutch made from a thick branch, they unexpectedly stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station. Judging by its architecture and condition, it had been built back in the 30s or 40s of the last century, during the formative years of the national park. The walls of thick logs had blackened with time and weather. The wooden shingle roof was leaking in places, and the windows were either boarded up or simply gaped with empty sockets. But despite its decaying and derelict appearance, the structure remained sturdy enough to provide temporary shelter from the elements and, as they hoped, from their pursuers. This was their hope for a respite. Entering, the rangers found a scene typical of such abandoned places. Dust, cobwebs, signs of small rodents, and remnants of some primitive furniture. A crudely made table, a couple of overturned chairs, a rusty iron potbelly stove in the corner. While the senior ranger and the technician inspected the premises for possible danger and tried to somehow arrange it for temporary stay, Claire, sorting through a pile of old junk, stumbled upon an interesting item. It was a thick leather-bound diary or journal heavily damaged by time and dampness. The pages had yellowed and become brittle, the ink had faded in places, but much remained legible. The first entry stated that the diary belonged to a certain Jeremiah Hawks, a ranger who had served in this area in the 40s. Flipping through the pages, Claire read the old ranger's entries with growing interest and anxiety. Jeremiah Hawks described in detail his encounters with night creatures, werewolves, or, as he also called them, children of the moon. He cited local Native American legends and beliefs associated with these creatures, mentioning that they possessed incredible strength, speed, and regenerative abilities. And most importantly, he wrote that silver burned their flesh like red-hot iron, and fire was the only thing that truly frightened or stopped them. Suddenly, the senior ranger, who was standing by one of the partially boarded-up windows, trying to see something through the curtain of fog, quietly called the others. When the fog momentarily lifted, revealing a view of a distant, forest-covered mountainside, they saw them. 3 dark, massive figures, standing motionless among the trees, and undoubtedly watching the station. The distance was too great to make out details, but their silhouettes were unmistakably recognizable. It was the pack, and they were acting in a coordinated manner, patiently waiting for their moment. The realization that they were not just being pursued, but were under observation by an entire pack of these creatures, added a new, even more sinister dimension to the situation. The group's resources were dwindling. Ammunition for the senior ranger's pistol and for Claire's weapon, she also carried a service pistol, was scarce, only a couple of magazines each. The technician had only half a box of buckshot shells left for his shotgun. Food and water were severely limited, enough for one day at most. The senior ranger, assessing all this, decided to use the station as a temporary fortress. "We'll stay here tonight," he said. "We'll barricade the windows and door with everything we can find. We'll leave only small loopholes for shooting. We'll fight them off here as long as we have ammunition, or until we think of something else. I don't see any other way out for now." Claire, recalling what she had read in Jeremiah Hawks's diary, found a mention there that werewolves, according to lore, feared a certain plant, wolfsbane or monkshood, aconitum lycoctonum, which, as the old ranger wrote, grew abundantly in these mountains. She recognized the plant from the description and a drawing made by Hawks's hand. She had seen it before during her patrols, but had paid it no mind. It was a faint, ghostly, but still a hope. The knowledge of the old ranger, recorded more than half a century ago, was now their chance to survive the coming night. Night fell quickly on the mountains, bringing with it not only darkness, but also a penetrating cold. The senior ranger began to suffer from a high fever. The wound on his forearm burned like fire, a throbbing pain spreading throughout his arm, reaching his shoulder. He had fragmented, nightmarish dreams in which he ran through the night forest on all fours, feeling the damp earth beneath him and the smell of blood, tearing at someone's yielding flesh with his fangs and claws. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He felt his nails thickening and roughening, his teeth aching and elongating. Claire, on watch at one of the improvised loopholes, noticed his condition. She approached, touched his forehead. It was scorching. In her eyes, illuminated by the dim light of the single remaining kerosene lamp they had found in the station, read fear and deep sympathy. "Chief, what's wrong with you? Are you very sick?" she asked quietly. The wounded technician, who, despite his weakness and the pain from his wound, was also trying to stay awake and maintain a defense, saw the senior ranger's fever-distorted face and heard his ragged, hoarse breathing. He struggled to sit up on his improvised bed of old sacks and quietly but insistently addressed Claire when the senior ranger again fell into a restless sleep. "Listen, if he starts to change, you have to be ready. We have to be ready." He fumbled with a pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single shotgun shell. The slug in this shell was not made of lead, but of a dully gleaming metal. "This is a silver slug," he whispered. "My grandpa made it when he was young, said it helped against all sorts of evil. I always carried it as a talisman. Now it looks like it might have another use." Claire looked at him in horror, then at the sleeping senior ranger. She shook her head fiercely. "No! We'll find a way to help him. I don't believe in this." But deep down, she knew. The technician was right, and the thought chilled her blood. Remembering old Jeremiah Hawks's diary, Claire and the senior ranger, during brief moments when his fever slightly receded and his consciousness cleared, began to frantically search the station for anything silver. Their search was successful. In an old, rusty tobacco tin that had fallen behind the stove, They found several old silver dollars, minted in the early 20th century, and a couple of tarnished cupronickel spoons. Using the old potbelly stove, which they managed to convert into a makeshift forge by intensely stoking its firebox to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and improvised tools, pliers from a multi-tool and an old can opener, they made a desperate attempt to melt this meager amount of silver. Then, with great difficulty, they poured the molten metal into a few empty casings, having previously removed the powder and primers, and attached tiny pieces of solidified silver to the tips of several arrows they had hastily carved from straight branches. The work was hellish, burning their fingers and almost fruitless. There was too little silver, and their technology too primitive. Nevertheless, they managed to produce a few semblances of silver bullets and arrows, whose effectiveness was highly doubtful. Parallel to this, they prepared other improvised weapons. From an old kerosene lamp found in the station, which still had some kerosene left, and several empty glass bottles, they fashioned a few Molotov cocktails, using strips of fabric torn from an old blanket as wicks. Claire, remembering the wolfsbane Hawks had written about, and having some botanical knowledge, managed to identify this poisonous plant among the dense thickets around the station when it was still light. Risking being seen, she gathered some of its roots and leaves, and was now preparing from them, following the vague and fragmentary instructions from the diary, a concentrated decoction or powder, which, according to the old ranger, was deadly to the children of the moon. Meanwhile, the wounded technician's condition also caused serious concern. His wound on the shoulder and side was severely inflamed, the skin around it swollen and an unhealthy purplish color. He too began to suffer from fever, often lapsing into delirium and shouting incoherent phrases. Claire, examining his wound, realized with alarm he was developing sepsis. His wound was also infected by something transmitted from the attacking creature, but this infection manifested differently, more slowly, than the senior ranger's. The senior ranger, gathering the last remnants of his will and temporarily overcoming the feverish fog in his head, addressed his comrades. His voice was weak, but steel still resonated in it. Tonight they will definitely come for us. We must hold out until dawn at any cost. Hawks's diary says these creatures usually operate in a pack and they have a leader, an alpha. If we manage to wound, or better yet, kill this alpha, the others might panic and retreat. He said this, but he himself felt something dark and powerful pressing on his mind, as invisible tentacles tried to penetrate his consciousness. He almost physically sensed the alpha's presence somewhere nearby, its malice, its hunger, its call. The rest of the day passed in oppressive stillness. The werewolves did not show themselves, made no sound. This silence, filled with the expectation of an imminent attack, pressed on their nerves much more than an open threat or pursuit. The rangers, exhausted physically and morally, prepared for the worst, saving every bullet, every drop of kerosene, every grain of hope. They barricaded the door and windows with remnants of furniture and boards torn from the floor, leaving only narrow loopholes. They distributed sectors of fire and their meager supplies of improvised weapons among themselves. The night promised to be long. It threatened to be their last. 10 p.m. with the onset of complete darkness, as the moon, hidden by a thick layer of clouds, never appeared in the sky, the pack attacked. It all began with a howl, a long, multi-voiced, blood-curdling cry that came from all sides simultaneously, surrounding the small, lost-in-the-woods station with a dense ring of primal horror. Then came the first blows against the walls, heavy, dull, shaking the dilapidated structure to its very foundation. The boards covering the windows creaked, and the sound of claws scraping against wood was heard. The werewolves, no longer hiding, broke in through windows, doors, and even through the roof itself. A desperate defense began. The senior ranger, Claire, and even the severely weakened but unbroken technician, who had taken up a position at one of the loopholes, opened fire. The Glock and Sig Sauer pistols barked furiously, spitting short tongues of flame into the darkness. The Remington shotgun shook the air with a deafening roar with each shot. Ordinary bullets, hitting the attackers, wounded them, made them howl in pain and rage, but did not stop them. These creatures possessed incredible vitality and did not feel pain like ordinary living beings. However, the few homemade silver slugs that the technician had loaded into his shotgun produced a completely different effect. Upon hitting their target, they made the werewolves emit a piercing, unnatural shriek, and smoking, charred wounds remained on their hides where they were hit. Several Molotov cocktails, thrown by Claire at the most active groups of attackers, created temporary fire barriers, forcing the creatures to retreat from the station walls with howls, but only for a short time. The technician's shotgun, its meager supply of 10 rounds quickly spent, fell silent. The struggle with his own transformation became almost unbearable for the senior ranger. He felt the pack's fury, their hunger, their primal thirst for blood resonating with something dark awakening within him. At times his vision blurred. He saw the world in distorted crimson tones, his hands cramped, and a low guttural snarl escaped his throat. In such moments, his eyes momentarily flashed with an unhealthy yellow light. But each time this happened, with incredible effort of will, he pulled himself back to reality, clinging to the remnants of his humanity. Claire, noticing his condition, tried to stay close, spoke to him in a quiet, soothing voice, reminded him who he was, tried to keep him on the edge, not let him fall into the abyss. Despite the desperate resistance, the defender's strength was waning. One of the werewolves, possessing particular strength and ferocity, managed to break through one of the weakest sections of the wall, knocking out several logs. A huge dark-furred figure with burning eyes burst into the station. The technician, who was closest to the breach trying to protect Claire, who was in the monster's path, threw aside his now empty and useless shotgun and with a cry, lunged at the werewolf with a small axe they had found in the corner of the station. It was an act of desperate, suicidal bravery. The werewolf, without even slowing down, killed him with one lightning-fast snap of its monstrous jaws on his neck. Claire, witnessing this, let out a piercing scream of horror and despair. At that moment, another figure appeared in the breach in the wall. It was the Alpha, the pack leader. It was significantly larger than the other werewolves. Its fur was bluish-black, and its eyes burned with a cold, intelligent, and incredibly cruel fire. Unlike the other pack members, it didn't charge. It stopped in the breach and simply looked at the senior ranger. And the senior ranger felt it. A powerful, almost physically palpable telepathic pressure emanating from the Alpha. He heard no words, but he understood the pack leader's thoughts, its silent call to join them, to accept his true nature, to become one of them, to gain power and eternal life in exchange for his humanity. The temptation was incredibly strong, almost irresistible, especially now, when his own body was betraying him. Claire had almost no ammunition left, only a few rounds in her last magazine. The Senior Ranger's situation was no better. The fire from the thrown Molotov cocktails outside began to gradually subside. The station was almost destroyed and threatened to collapse at any moment. Hope was fading with every second. At this moment of despair, Claire, seeing that the Senior Ranger had almost succumbed to the Alpha's mental onslaught, his eyes beginning to glaze over with a yellow film, his body convulsing in the death throes of transformation, remembered the last almost illegible entry in Jeremiah Hawks's diary. The old ranger had written that the mark of the beast, received from a werewolf's bite or scratch, could be removed or reversed if the Alpha who transmitted the mark was destroyed in a certain ritualistic way, or if the marked one himself, by his own will, rejected this gift at the cost of great physical and spiritual pain. But for this, he needed help from outside. She didn't know how to do it, but she knew she had to try. She decided to risk everything she had left. Gathering her last strength and courage, Claire screamed at the Senior Ranger, trying to break through the fog enveloping his consciousness. "Chief, hang on. We have to break through. Aim for the Alpha. I'll cover you." Without waiting for an answer, she smashed the remains of the boards in the nearest window opening with the butt of her pistol, and, taking a deep breath, jumped out into the very center of the werewolf pack swarming around the station. She began firing her pistol, aiming not so much to kill as to distract the creature's attention to herself, to create at least a few precious seconds for the Senior Ranger. Her actions were pure madness, but in them was a desperate, almost irrational hope. The Senior Ranger, hearing her cry and shots, seemed to awaken from a heavy sleep. Something in her voice, in her selfless act, stirred the remnants of human consciousness within him, forced him to fight. Despair, the last spark of humanity, and the primal instinct of a warrior answering a challenge. All this made him charge the Alpha with a furious roar, who was still standing in the breach in the wall, watching him with its icy eyes. The Senior Ranger's transformation at that moment was almost complete. He had become noticeably larger, his muscles bulged under his tearing clothes, his fingers turned into clawed paws, and his face contorted into a bestial snarl. It was a battle of two titans, two alpha males, one desperately clinging to his fading humanity, the other embodying primal, untamed darkness. While the Senior Ranger and the Alpha clashed in a furious, deadly struggle, tearing each other apart with claws and teeth, Claire, dodging attacks from other werewolves and firing her last rounds, tried to get closer to the duel. In her hand was clutched her last, most precious round, the one she had loaded with crumbs of molten silver from old dollars and smeared with the thick, dark decoction of aconite roots she had managed to prepare. This was her only and last hope. Choosing a moment when the Alpha, pinning the Senior Ranger to the ground, momentarily exposed itself, she fired a desperate shot almost point blank. The small piece of silver, coated with poison, hit the Alpha squarely in the left eye. The pack leader let out a deafening, unnatural howl full of unbearable pain. The very mountain seemed to tremble from it. Its huge body began to writhe in terrible convulsions. thick black smoke with a disgusting smell of burnt flesh and sulfur pouring from the eye wound and its maw. After a few moments, it fell silent, collapsing to the ground in a lifeless heap of fur and bones. The Alpha's death caused an instant chain reaction among the other pack members. Their rage and aggression turned to panic and terror. Emitting pitiful, frightened yelps, they scattered, disappearing into the night forest as quickly as they had appeared. At the very moment the Alpha died, the mark on the Senior Ranger's arm, which had been burning with an infernal fire, flared with new, unbearable intensity, causing him such pain that he lost consciousness. His body shuddered in a final convulsion, and then the transformation process, which had been almost complete, suddenly reversed. He began to shrink, his claws and fangs retracted, his fur disappeared, returning him to human form. When he regained consciousness a few minutes later, he was human again, though terribly wounded, both physically and mentally, and almost completely exhausted. He had survived, but he was no longer the same. Even the reverse transformation had left an indelible mark on him. A part of the beast had taken permanent residence in his soul. His senses, hearing, sight, smell, remained sharpened to a superhuman level. He began to suffer from nightmares in which he relived the horrors of that night over and over again. He suffered from partial amnesia, not remembering some details of what had happened, especially the moments of his near-complete transformation. And his personality had subtly but noticeably changed. He became more withdrawn, sullen, suspicious. Chaos and destruction reigned around them. The station was almost completely demolished. The ground around it was trampled and torn up, littered with debris of logs, boards, and furniture. Amidst this chaos, dark, motionless silhouettes were visible here and there. The corpses of several werewolves, felled by the technician's silver slugs, or the fire from the Molotov cocktails. The air was filled with the smell of smoke, blood, and death. Claire, herself barely able to stand from exhaustion, wounds, and the horror she had experienced, ran to the Senior Ranger, helped him up. Together, supporting each other, they walked out of the ruins of the station and met the dawn. The pale gray sun slowly rose above the mountain peaks, illuminating the scene of the recent battle. Exhausted, covered in blood, dirt, and soot, they had survived. But the price of this survival was enormous, and the scars left by that night would remain with them forever. Around 7 a.m., as the first rays of the rising sun timidly pierced through the morning fog enveloping the mountain peaks, help finally reached the ruins of the abandoned station. It was a joint rescue team, consisting of other park rangers and a SWAT team from the county sheriff's office. Their arrival was the result of several factors. First, an automatic emergency beacon, integrated into one of the Alpha Team's communication devices damaged during the night attack, had transmitted a weak, intermittent distress signal that was picked up at base. Second, after Alpha Team failed to make contact at the scheduled time, a second search party was immediately organized, which had followed their trail from the very beginning of the Elkmont Trail. Bad weather, difficult terrain, and loss of communication had significantly slowed their progress, but they had pressed on relentlessly. The scene that met the rescuers' eyes was indescribable and defied any rational explanation. Amidst the smoking ruins of the old station, they found the Senior Ranger and Claire in a state of deep shock, covered in caked blood, with multiple wounds and bruises. Nearby lay the body of their comrade, the technician, with signs of horrific mutilation. And around in the clearing were the remains of several large, strange-looking animals that bore no resemblance to any known inhabitants of these mountains. Explaining what had happened based on logic and common sense was impossible. The official search, heavily managed by the men in suits who arrived shortly after, quietly concluded weeks later. The remains of the 2 missing children were eventually found, tucked away deep within a narrow, almost inaccessible crevice miles from the Elkmont Trail, their fate a grim testament to the horrors that stalk the Smokies. Soon after the first rescue team arrived at the scene, other people began to converge. Among them were those who did not wear ranger or police uniforms. These were men in suits, stern, uncommunicative men in plain civilian clothes, who arrived in inconspicuous black vehicles straight from Washington. They identified themselves as employees of an unnamed federal agency and immediately took control of the incident investigation. They represented a secret government unit dealing with paranormal phenomena and incidents that did not fit into the framework of official science. Their main task was not so much investigation as concealing the truth about what had happened, to avoid mass panic, prevent the closure of the national park to visitors, and keep secret the existence of what the Rangers had encountered. The official version, which they quickly concocted and disseminated to the public through controlled channels, stated, "A tragic incident caused by an attack by a pack of exceptionally large and aggressive black bears, presumably rabid. All evidence pointing otherwise, strange tracks, unusual wounds on the bodies, remains of unknown creatures, the old ranger's diary, homemade silver bullets, was immediately seized, classified, and taken away to an unknown location. The surviving rangers, the senior ranger and Claire, underwent a long course of medical and psychological rehabilitation. Both developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They were haunted by nightmares in which they relived the horrors of that night over and over. During the day, they were tormented by flashbacks, vivid, intrusive memories of screams, blood, bared fangs, and burning eyes. They became suspicious, withdrawn, and lost trust in the surrounding world, which now seemed fragile and full of hidden threats. Claire almost stopped talking, spending most of her time alone trying to comprehend and process what she had witnessed. The senior ranger, in addition to PTSD, struggled with the consequences of his mark and his near transformation. He felt that something had changed in him forever. That part of the darkness he had encountered remained within him. The senior ranger's fate after being discharged from the hospital was predetermined. He submitted his resignation from the National Park Service, unable to bear being in those places that had become a symbol of horror and loss for him. The mark on his arm healed, leaving a deep, ugly scar, but the scar on his soul was even deeper. He sold his house, bought a small plot of land in a remote, sparsely populated area in the north of the country, and moved there, trying to live in seclusion, far from people. Simultaneously, he began to gather any available information about similar creatures, cases of attacks, ancient legends, and beliefs related to werewolves. He felt his struggle was not yet over, and the part of darkness that remained with him would one day demand its due again.